A black, single mom just boarded first class alone. Quiet, barely noticed, but 7 minutes later, the head flight attendant was being fired in front of the entire cabin. No one could have predicted what happened in between. A glass of water, a slap, and a truth so heavy, it cracked the entire system midair. Stay with me. This is a story you need to hear. But before we dive in, comment below and tell us where in the world you're watching from, and if you've ever felt like someone judged you before even knowing your name. Ready, let's begin. It started like any other boarding routine. Gate 47 at LAX was crowded, buzzing with the quiet chaos of business travelers, couples heading to weekend getaways, and the usual smattering of impatient flyers scrolling their phones, watching the minutes tick down. But amid all of that, she stood still. Celeste Morgan, 34, tall, composed, with skin like polished mahogany and eyes that didn't scan the crowd, but instead looked through it. She wasn't trying to stand out, and yet she did by the sheer force of her calm. No flashy jewelry, no designer handbag screaming for attention, just a simple navy blue suit, a small black leather laptop case, and a quiet kind of grace that made you look twice, even if you didn't know why. She scanned her boarding pass quietly and stepped into the jet bridge. The temperature dropped slightly as she entered the plane, the soft hum of filtered air and subtle jazz music, welcoming her into what was supposed to be a world of comfort and professionalism. But comfort, for her, had always come with terms and conditions, especially in spaces coded for the privileged, especially when her skin arrived before her resume. The aircraft was a beauty. Italian caramel-colored leather seats, gold-plated clock frames, a minibar with names like Veuve Clicquot and Glenfiddich etched in cursive. This wasn't a normal flight, it was a statement. And yet, somehow, Celeste didn't look impressed. She simply took it in with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen finer. At the front of the cabin stood Lauren Briggs, early 40s, perfectly coiled blonde bun, uniform crisp to regulation, eyes that flickered not with welcome but with judgment. She had been in the industry for 15 years, and somewhere along the way, she had started believing she could read people. She prided herself on being able to spot the troublemakers, those who didn't fit the script of first-class passengers. And today her eyes narrowed ever so slightly when she saw Celeste step in. Lauren greeted the Thompsons, first a white couple in their 60s, dressed in coordinated cashmere and smiles. "Welcome aboard," she chimed, bowing slightly as she took Mrs. Thompson's hand, her voice softened like silk and hot tea. "It's always a pleasure to serve you." Then she turned and saw Celeste. Her smile dropped like a curtain. "Hello," she said flatly, eyes scanning Celeste's low heels and dark skin. "I hope you're not lost." It wasn't a question. It was a statement, sharpened into a test. Celeste didn't flinch. She didn't argue or smile politely to ease the tension. She just nodded once, looked her in the eye, and moved toward her seat. The air between them tightened. That was the moment Lauren made her decision. She didn't know who Celeste was, but she knew she didn't belong here. Not by how she carried herself, not by her silence, but by something unspoken. Something Lauren had learned to trust too well, bias disguised as instinct. As Celeste approached her seat 1A, Lauren stepped directly into her path. "Excuse me," she said, her tone light but edged. "This section is for priority passengers only." Celeste lifted her phone, the e-ticket bright on the screen. "And I am one of them," she said gently, not challenging, just stating a fact. Lauren didn't even glance at the ticket. "Strange," she muttered. "I don't remember seeing your name on the list." Behind them, murmurs began just enough to feed the tension, not enough to break it. A woman with Cartier glasses whispered, "Probably another last-minute upgrade." On the other side of the aisle, a businessman in a tailored gray suit watched silently, one eyebrow raised. The whispers didn't sting Celeste, not because they weren't meant to, but because she'd heard them all her life. Every room she entered, every table she dared sit at, there was always someone questioning whether she belonged. Lauren crossed her arms. "I don't need to check the list," she said coldly. "I know who's allowed here, Baum, but it wasn't about the list. It was about who looked right. Who dressed right? Who fit?" Celeste's voice didn't rise. "Perhaps you should check again before assuming." "Perhaps," Lauren snapped, "you should move before I have to call security." And there it was, the line. The moment when everything shifted, because Celeste didn't back down. She didn't argue. She just looked at Lauren, her gaze still, deep, unshakable. "Call if you feel the need," she said. Her words weren't loud, but they echoed like thunder in the cabin. The businessman closed his laptop. A few passengers stiffened, even Grace. The young assistant flight attendant looked up from the manifest. Lauren hesitated. There was something in Celeste's voice, not arrogance, not defiance, but something she hadn't anticipated: power, still hidden beneath the surface. Lauren turned, barking toward Grace. "Move her to economy." Grace didn't budge. Her hands clutched the passenger log. Her lips parted, but she said nothing. Because right there, at the top of the list, in bold capital letters, was the name Celeste Morgan. Confidential priority status. Grace's eyes darted to Celeste, then to Lauren. Celeste looked at her, voice light. "Do you really want to be part of this?" Lauren lost her patience. "She's just looking for trouble," she snapped, "pretending to belong here, sneaking into first class like some queen on a throne." That's when Daniel Green, the businessman in gray, spoke. "Ma'am," he said calmly but clearly, "I think you should check the list again before insulting someone in front of everyone." Lauren spun toward him. Disbelief and offense splattered across her face. "Don't you see where she's from?" she blurted. And just like that, she said what had been hiding in plain sight. Everyone heard it. The racism that had slithered beneath the surface now stood naked. Celeste didn't speak. She didn't need to. Because silence, in that moment, was louder than any protest. Lauren tried to recover. I am responsible for the cabin order. I know who is allowed here." Daniel asked again. "Then why haven't you opened the list?" Lauren had no answer. Celeste slowly leaned back in her seat, her tone still polite, still deadly calm. "I am in the right place. Miss Briggs. And you, where are you?" The cabin fell into a silence so heavy it seemed to pin Lauren in place. She turned away, not because she wanted to, but because she knew she had already lost. But she didn't give up. People intoxicated by power rarely do. And what she did next would change everything. She returned, tray in hand, smile fake as wax. She served champagne first to the Thompsons, then Daniel, then Megan Sinclair with her Chanel bag. But when she reached Celeste, she didn't stop. She passed by like Celeste was invisible. Only when the tray was almost empty did Celeste finally speak. "Excuse me, may I have a glass of water?" Lauren turned, her eyes icy, her voice clinical. "I'll be back when I'm done." 5 minutes later, she returned with water. And in that moment, something cracked. Not the glass, not the silence, but the last restraint in Lauren's mask. She spilled the water deliberately, on Celeste's pants, on the floor, and when the tray clinked, and the water splashed, she screamed, "You put your foot in the way." But Celeste just looked at her, soaked and silent, then said the words that opened the gates to everything that would come. "You did that on purpose." And nothing, not protocol, not seniority, not polished smiles could stop what was about to happen next. She didn't ask for a throne. She built it. And then she walked away from it, not out of arrogance, not out of secrecy, but out of necessity. Celeste Morgan had learned long ago that when you sit too high for too long, people only see the title, not the truth. So on this particular flight, the woman in the navy blue suit wasn't a CEO. She wasn't the founder of the fastest growing luxury airline in America. She wasn't even someone of interest. To them, she was just another face, another anomaly in a space they assumed wasn't meant for her. And that was exactly what she needed to see. 2 days before boarding flight WS-472, Celeste had stood in front of a room filled with strategists and executives, all carefully manicured and well-fed on performance charts. They were discussing service metrics and passenger satisfaction scores. They talked of algorithms, focus groups, VIP memberships, but none of them talked about bias. Not directly, not with honesty. One manager, a well-meaning but oblivious man named Harvey, said, "We haven't had a formal discrimination complaint in over 6 months, so that means things are working." Celeste didn't reply then. She only nodded, took a sip of her espresso, and made a mental note. Silence wasn't evidence of success, it was evidence of fear. And the absence of complaint often pointed to something more dangerous than outrage, learned helplessness. That night, she booked herself a first-class ticket under a private alias, bypassing executive flagging protocols. She instructed the database team to suppress her usual markers, hide her VIP flag, and remove her from the crew alert roster. She chose flight WS-472 because it was one of the busiest bicoastal routes and had recently received both praise and two minor but suspicious incident reports from passengers of color. None had escalated, but they haunted her. So when she arrived at the terminal that day, she didn't bring a bodyguard, a PR manager, or a press photographer. She brought herself and the story of every person who had ever emailed her, messaged her, or stopped her quietly at events to say, "Thank you for building a space for us. But sometimes it still doesn't feel like it belongs to us." She thought about one of those stories as she walked through the terminal. Unnoticed, a retired black school teacher named Lillian from Atlanta, who had been asked to switch seats with no explanation after a white couple complained about being uncomfortable. Lillian never made it into any complaint file. Instead, she had mailed Celeste a handwritten letter. "I didn't want to stir trouble." She wrote, "I just thought you should know. I still love your airline. I just wish your vision made it all the way to the cabin floor." Celeste never forgot that. It was Lillian's story, and dozens like it, that shaped her decision to blend in, to be unseen, to see, instead, how the ground floor of her dream was holding up when no one was watching, when the uniforms forgot to perform, when smiles turned into sneers the moment no title glimmered under the collar. She had trained herself to walk like an ordinary passenger, just confident enough to avoid suspicion, just quiet enough to be ignored. And it worked, for the most part, until she met Lauren Briggs. There was a moment, right before the confrontation began, when Celeste had nearly revealed herself. When she stepped onto the aircraft and felt the cold welcome of Lauren's tone, the absurdity of the situation almost amused her. But then something shifted, the way Lauren looked through her, and not at her, not around her, through her, as if she wasn't even human. Just a problem wrapped in melanin and quiet defiance. And that was when Celeste chose to let the game play out. Lauren had no idea she was being observed not just by Celeste, but by a system Celeste had quietly installed over the past 2 years. Body cams and crew uniforms disguised as ID clips. Biometric facial recognition analytics designed to study micro-reactions and behavior discrepancies based on perceived race, gender, attire. All of it had been calibrated with academic partnerships from 3 major universities. But none of that mattered if no one ever triggered the system. Lauren, in her arrogance, triggered it all. When she blocked the path, when she ignored the digital ticket, when she snapped and threatened to call security. Every micro-expression, tightened jaw, narrowed gaze, upturned lip was logged. The algorithm didn't accuse her. It didn't judge. It simply flagged, and quietly, without knowing it. Lauren's behavior set off a chain of internal alerts. In a data room thousands of miles away, a line of code shifted from yellow to red. Meanwhile, Celeste sat still. Every second of humiliation was recorded not just by her internal sensors, but by the passengers around her. She knew the effect of collective silence. But she also knew the weight of a well-timed word. So she said little, watched much. When the water spilled, she didn't move. When the tray tilted and Lauren barked lies into the air, she didn't retaliate. She waited. And when she finally spoke those quiet, 5-word verdicts, she knew exactly what she was doing. You did that on purpose. But behind that composed delivery was a storm. Not of anger, but of memory. Because this wasn't the first time she'd been spilled on. It wasn't the first time someone had assumed she didn't belong. Years ago, before Right Skies, before the title, before the suits. She had boarded a budget flight with her daughter strapped to her chest, her ticket printed on cheap thermal paper. The gate agent had looked at her and said, "You sure this is your seat?" The tone wasn't curious. It was accusatory. And when she insisted, the woman asked for ID again, even though it had already been scanned. That day, she was forced to move. Not because she had to, but because she couldn't afford the scene. She couldn't afford the delay. Her baby was teething. Her own cheeks were raw from crying. She gave up the fight, sat in the back near the lavatory, and watched as her assigned seat was handed over to a white man in a Patagonia vest who had arrived late. No apology was given, Mom. Not then, not ever. So this moment on WS-472, it wasn't new. It was an echo, but now she was no longer the woman without power. Now she had the tools, the voice, the network, the law, and yet she still chose patience because she didn't want retribution. She wanted exposure, and exposure required precision. As she sat quietly wiping the cold water from her pants, her mind was already calculating. Not revenge, reform, not punishment, policy. She could hear Lauren muttering under her breath as she walked away, could feel the shift in the air among the passengers, some disturbed, others indifferent. A few silently rooting for Celeste, but too afraid to speak. That was the most heartbreaking part. The good ones, the decent ones, still unsure when or how to intervene. But one did, Grace Holloway. Celeste noticed the way Grace hesitated, how her hands trembled around the manifest, how her eyes darted, conflicted. And Celeste knew this young woman was at a crossroads, not just in her job, but in her own story. Would she stay silent, like so many before her, or would she choose the harder path, the one that risked her job but kept her dignity? That question would be answered soon enough. But for now, Celeste remained still. Her phone rested quietly in her lap. She hadn't yet touched the internal messaging app. Not yet. There was still more to see. Still more truth to gather before delivering the final reveal. Because the true test wasn't whether Lauren would crack. It was whether the system would protect her when she did. And that Celeste knew was the real reason she was on this flight. Lauren didn't return with water for nearly 7 minutes. In the rhythm of a flight's early service phase, 7 minutes might not seem like much, but in the thick, awkward silence that followed her last threat, those 7 minutes stretched like molasses in a room full of judgment. Passengers didn't speak openly. Not yet, but they whispered in pairs, stealing glances at Celeste, who sat soaked but silent, legs crossed at the ankle, eyes fixed forward like a queen displaced but unshaken. Every so often, a quiet cough, a rustling page, or a click of a pen cut through the atmosphere, reminders that they were still airborne, still human, still waiting. Grace Holloway, the junior attendant, remained frozen near the galley, her grip tightening on the passenger manifest. She'd read Celeste's name 3 times now, Cell A's Morgan. It was impossible to miss. The only name marked in gold, priority flag, do not interrupt. And yet, Lauren had interrupted everything. Grace's heart was racing. Her training manuals had drilled one message over and over again: passenger dignity comes before personal discomfort. And yet here she was, watching that very dignity drown under the silence of fear. Grace looked toward the cockpit door, then back at Lauren, who finally reemerged with a new tray, this time not of wine, but bottled waters. Her smile was back, but dulled, robotic, the kind of smile that begged to be believed. She handed waters down the aisle, her tone clipped and sweet. Here you go, sir, and for you, ma'am. When she reached Celeste, her hand twitched slightly, as if her own body betrayed her intentions. Celeste's leg, casually resting into the aisle just slightly, was in no way obstructive. But Lauren altered her course just enough. The silver tray tilted. A splash. Cold water scattered like shattered glass onto Celeste's lap, across her blazer, dripping to the floor like a miniature rainfall. And for a half second, the world stopped. A hush. A silence so acute it hummed. Then Lauren gasped. Loud, theatrical. Oh my God, you had your leg in the way. Look what you've done, her voice carried down the cabin like a flare, beckoning attention. Mr. Thompson startled in his seat. Megan Sinclair, in her Chanel, put down her magazine. Daniel Green blinked and slowly closed his laptop again. But it wasn't Lauren's shriek that caught their breath. It was Celeste's lack of one. She didn't flinch. She looked down at her soaked clothes with the serenity of someone who had seen worse. Then, slowly, methodically, she reached for a tissue from her blazer pocket. 1, 2, 3 gentle dabs. The water seeped into the fabric. It was cold, but not as cold as what followed. Celeste's voice emerged. Clear, calm, devastating. You did that on purpose. Lauren's face twisted. What did you just say? Celeste repeated it. You did that on purpose. And all I ask is to be treated with the same respect as everyone else. The line floated in the air like the echo of a gavel. Not angry, not dramatic, just irrefutably true. Behind them, Grace dropped the manifest. Papers scattered near her feet. Her hands trembled, not from shock but from relief. Someone had said what she hadn't had the courage to. Daniel Green stood, slow but certain, brushing the wrinkles from his pants as he stepped into the aisle. "Miss Briggs," he said, voice like a lawyer mid-trial, "you've assaulted a passenger in front of more than 10 witnesses. Do you understand the legal implications of what you've done?" Lauren turned toward him, her mouth moving before her brain. "Assault. It was an accident. She obstructed me." "That's not what I saw," Daniel replied calmly. "And I believe the cameras on board will show the truth." Her face paled. Cameras. Of course. She knew they were there, embedded discreetly, part of Right Sky's new internal safety program. But in her fury, she hadn't thought twice. Celeste stood now, not suddenly, not dramatically, but like a sunrise. Quiet, inevitable, commanding. She adjusted her blazer. Her cheeks still carried the redness of earlier humiliation, but her voice carried something even stronger. "I am in the right seat, Miss Briggs," she said, echoing the earlier conversation with haunting precision. "But where are you?" And then she turned, slowly, toward Grace. "Can I ask for a towel?" Grace blinked away the moisture gathering in her eyes. "Yes, yes, Miss Morgan." Of course, that name, Miss Morgan. It slipped out like instinct, and Lauren caught it. "Morgan," she repeated. "Miss Morgan." Her eyes darted toward Grace, then back to Celeste. Wait, no. But the click had already begun. The mental filing system she had used for years started to malfunction. That face, that calm, that presence. She'd seen it somewhere on a memo in training slides or perhaps on the company's anniversary video last year. Celeste Morgan, the founder, the CEO, the one whose personal story was highlighted in every onboarding session, raised by a single mother, built the company with borrowed money and a stubborn dream, preached dignity in the skies. That's Celeste Morgan. And Lauren. She had just doused her in water, screamed at her, lied, and now her world was beginning to tilt. Lauren took a step back, knocking the tray against a seat arm. Her voice turned soft, desperate. I didn't know who you were." Celeste's gaze didn't soften. "And if I had been no one, would your actions have been different?" The question gutted the cabin. No one moved. No one exhaled. Megan Sinclair slowly took off her sunglasses. Mr. Thompson folded his paper and turned fully toward the aisle. Daniel remained still, arms crossed. Grace stood straighter. And then, as if the atmosphere itself changed polarity, footsteps emerged from the cockpit, confident, fast. Captain Ross Wellington, tall and silver-haired, appeared at the aisle entrance, his jaw clenched with the force of a man already informed. He looked around, assessing the silent crowd, then stopped at Celeste. His posture straightened. "Miss Morgan," he said formally, his voice carrying a tone of unmistakable deference. "We've just received a direct message from operations. I've been instructed to follow emergency protocol. Is there anything you need from us at this moment?" The air shifted. The cabin murmured soft. Stunned. Megan dropped her bag. Someone gasped. Lauren's knees slightly buckled. Celeste glanced around slowly, then back to Ross. "I need to finish what's been started. But first, she needs to be removed." Lauren stepped back again. "No. Wait, Captain. Please, I didn't know." "That's exactly the problem," Celeste said. Her voice had not risen. But somehow it now filled every seat, every mind item, every gut. "You treated me like nothing because you assumed I was nothing." Ross didn't hesitate. "Understood," he said. "Crew reassignment is immediate. Please take your seat. Miss Morgan, we will handle this." He turned to Grace. "Assist her." Grace nodded, stepping forward, finally standing in her truth. She gently touched Celeste's arm, not as a servant, but as a witness choosing her side, and Celeste returned the touch with a nod. The storm was here now, but it wasn't loud. It wasn't chaotic. It was surgical. A storm of reckoning, of consequence, of correction. Celeste sat back down, slowly. Lauren, still trembling, stumbled backward toward the galley. Behind her, silence returned, but not the same silence from before. This silence was charged. It was ready. Something in the air had shifted permanently. And for the first time in her entire career, Lauren felt what it was like to sit inside a storm that she herself had summoned with every word, every lie, every assumption. And Celeste, she sat soaked. Yes, but untouchable, unshakable. And finally, what we see, fully seen, Lauren didn't leave the cabin right away. Though the captain's words had been clear immediate reassignment, protocol engaged, she lingered near the galley, hands gripping the edge of the service counter, like it was the only stable thing left in her unraveling world. Her mind, once sharp with orders and corrections, now struggled to hold a single thought. Her throat was dry, her breath shallow. Every attempt to retreat with dignity collapsed under the weight of what she'd done, and what was worse, what she now knew. Celeste Morgan wasn't just a passenger, she was the blueprint, the story behind every Right Skies training video, every core values slide deck, every speech about what modern hospitality should look like. Celeste Morgan, who had once served coffee in diners during graveyard shifts to afford aviation school, who had turned a single leased plane into an empire that now employed thousands. Celeste Morgan, who had just been humiliated and doused in water by her own company's lead representative. And now she sat calmly in seat 1A, quietly typing something into her phone. Not in anger, not in performance, but in a silence that felt more dangerous than shouting. That silence sent a signal louder than any lawsuit. She was preparing. The cabin was no longer frozen in awkward quiet. The passengers, once passive, were now alert. Daniel Green remained standing in the aisle, arms crossed, his jaw set. Megan Sinclair no longer played the silent observer. Her face was pale, her fingers twitching nervously over her phone as if unsure whether to document or disappear. Even Mr. Thompson, who had barely stirred during the first half of the flight, now leaned slightly forward, sensing that something historic was unfolding within a space designed to lull. A voice crackled through the intercom. It wasn't the usual pre-landing announcement. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've received instructions from operations and are initiating an emergency landing protocol. Estimated arrival at Hollow Creek Private Terminal in approximately 27 minutes. Please remain seated. No turbulence, no mechanical fault, just a quiet course correction by a system trying to clean its own mess. Lauren flinched at the words, emergency protocol. She wanted to vanish, but there was nowhere to go. Behind her, Grace moved with focused precision, not toward the galley, but toward Celeste. In her hand, she held a clean towel, a sealed bottle of water, and a quiet kind of redemption. She knelt slightly, offering the items with both hands. Celeste met her eyes, and for the first time, a soft flicker of warmth broke through the mask. "Thank you, Grace," she said. The younger woman nodded quickly. I just want to say, I saw everything. I didn't know if I should speak, but Celeste gently stopped her with a glance. You chose to act when it mattered. That's all that counts. Grace stood taller after that, not because of rank, but because of acknowledgement. Behind them, Lauren's knees wobbled again. The captain hadn't returned, but his authority lingered like perfume. She could feel the air turning against her, the looks, the breaths held just a little longer than usual. She turned toward the passengers, her voice cracking as she tried to explain. It wasn't I didn't mean, but the words betrayed her. They sounded hollow, rehearsed, panicked. A man near row 2 muttered under his breath, "She still thinks this is salvageable." Someone further back whispered, "Did she really slap her?" Another answered, "I heard it. You don't imagine a sound like that." Celeste didn't rise to answer. Instead, she reached into her carry-on and pulled out a thin black folder. Inside were printed documents, the kind only senior executives handled: emergency employee protocol sheets, updated ethics code briefings, even a sealed HR directive marked internal eyes only. She placed it neatly on the tray table before her. Grace's eyes widened. "Miss Morgan, is this for the internal review?" Celeste nodded once. "It's already started." Grace stepped back respectfully. Lauren, still watching, took a trembling breath and dared one final step forward. "Miss Morgan, please. I know what it looks like, but I swear I didn't know who you were." If I had Celeste cut her off, not with volume, but with clarity. If I had been someone else, someone without a title, would I have deserved better? Lauren froze. Celeste didn't wait for an answer. "That's not a rhetorical question. That's the point." A beat passed. then two, and then Daniel Green broke the tension. Miss Morgan, I've been on dozens of corporate flights. I've worked with more companies than I can name. But this, what you're doing right now, this is what leadership looks like. A ripple of agreement swept the cabin. Small nods, murmurs. Not of gossip, but of realization. Lauren stepped back, slowly, as if retreating from a battlefield where her weapons had turned into mirrors. Her reflection was ugly, and she couldn't look away. The plane began its descent. The captain announced final approach procedures. Passengers secured their trays in reclined seats, but their focus never left the front. As the aircraft touched down on the glossy black tarmac of Hollow Creek's private runway, the shadow of a waiting black SUV grew larger outside the window. It bore the Right Sky's insignia silver wings against a navy backdrop, and it was flanked by two executive aides in sharp suits. The door opened. Sunlight spilled into the cabin. The first assistant stepped aboard, voice formal and steady. Miss Morgan, the board is awaiting you. We have arranged for a full live debrief in 45 minutes. Celeste stood, adjusted her blazer, and turned to the cabin, not just to the staff, not just to the captain, but to every single passenger. Her voice rang out with composure. You've all witnessed something today. Not because I'm a CEO, but because I am a human being who was dehumanized by someone trusted to serve others with care. She turned toward Lauren one last time. Miss Briggs, effective immediately, you are relieved of all duties and dismissed from Right Skies Airlines. Your behavior was not just a violation of company policy, it was a betrayal of our core humanity. Lauren staggered back. Please, I need this job. This was never supposed to. Celeste didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. This was always supposed to be about respect. That's all anyone ever wants. You just didn't think you owed it to everyone. The assistants flanked Celeste now, guiding her toward the staircase. But just before she exited, a voice called from behind a trembling woman in the third row. Miss Morgan? Celeste turned slightly. Thank you for not staying silent. Celeste's expression softened. Silence is a privilege. I've outgrown it. And then she stepped into the sun. As the SUV pulled away, the passengers remained seated, unmoving, not because the seatbelt light was on, but because the weight of what had just transpired was still pressing down on them. Grace remained near the front, still clutching the manifest. She looked toward Lauren, whose name badge had just been removed by security, and then toward the space Celeste had left behind, dry now, but echoing with dignity. Outside, the engines cooled. Inside, the cabin warmed not with luxury, but with something far more valuable awakening. The car pulled away, its black body gleaming under the late afternoon sun, cutting across the runway like a signature being drawn in real time. Celeste Morgan sat in the back seat, eyes fixed not on her assistant's tablet displays or the schedule of emergency boardroom logistics, but on the shrinking figure of the aircraft behind them. She hadn't looked back during her walk down the stairs, nor as she stepped into the SUV. But now that distance had given space for reflection, she allowed herself a breath. Not of relief, but of quiet preparation, because it wasn't over. Not even close. Back inside the plane, the silence hadn't left. Lauren Briggs remained seated, shoulders collapsed, face ghost white, her flight attendant uniform now clashing grotesquely with the shame clinging to her. She hadn't been escorted out yet, but her name tag was gone, her headset removed. She sat like a statue carved out of disgrace, watching the final passengers whisper in clusters, not one of them daring to make eye contact. Even the Thompsons, whom she had greeted with so much warmth earlier, now sat stiff, avoiding her gaze like her failure might be contagious. Grace Holloway remained near the front of the cabin, still standing. She held nothing now, not the manifest, not water, not towels, but her stance alone was a statement. Her eyes, once filled with hesitance, now carried something firmer, clearer, resolve. The truth had landed on this aircraft long before the wheels touched the runway, and she'd watched it unfold. Not from a video, not from training, but from life unfiltered, raw, terrifying, and necessary. A murmur moved through the rows. She's really the CEO. You think she planned this? I mean, would it have come out otherwise, Megan? Sinclair finally spoke, her voice low and clipped. I've been flying with this airline for years. I've never seen anyone stand that calmly after what happened to her. Daniel Green, now back in his seat, folded his hands together, and looked ahead. Because power doesn't need to shout. It just needs to decide when to act. Then, as if summoned by some unseen script, the cockpit door opened again. This time it was Captain Ross who stepped into the cabin, not as a pilot issuing procedural instructions, but as a leader stepping into an ethical battlefield. He took in the passengers' expressions, pausing when his eyes found Lauren, then turning to address them all. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice steady and low. "What occurred on this flight was a breach not only of protocol, but of the values this airline claims to uphold. Miss Celeste Morgan, as you now know, is not only a passenger, she is the founder and CEO of Right Skies Airlines. The incident you witnessed has already been reported, and action has been taken." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle like fog over a runway. "There are times when the titles on our badges, the uniforms on our backs, or the ranks we hold make us believe we are safe from consequence. Today is not one of those times. Today is the kind of day when silence would be complicity. And for those who did speak up, for those who chose integrity over convenience, I commend you." The passengers listened, many nodding quietly, others simply absorbing. But it was Grace, still standing, who now became the focus of the captain's gaze. "Miss Holloway," he said, "you demonstrated extraordinary judgment under pressure. You honored our core values even when challenged by your superior. I will personally be recommending your immediate promotion." Grace's hand went to her guantimam. She blinked twice, but no tears came, just a deep, slow breath, the kind that follows the release of a long-held weight. "Thank you, Captain," she said, her voice tight but clear. "But I was just trying to do what was right." "And that," he replied, "is exactly why it matters." Lauren shifted in her seat, her eyes glazed and unfocused. She didn't speak, didn't defend. For once, the voice that had always dominated the cabin had nothing left to say. It wasn't long before two airport security officers boarded the plane. They moved with quiet authority, not rushing, not theatrical, just present, efficient, real. One carried a small tablet confirming identification. The other carried a sealed envelope from Right Skies Legal. "Miss Briggs," one officer said, his tone neutral, "we're here to escort you for internal debrief and disciplinary proceedings. You are currently under administrative investigation." Lauren stood slowly, her knees wobbly. She opened her mouth, but the words withered in her throat. She tried to meet Grace's eyes, but Grace looked past her. The passengers didn't clap. They didn't sneer, but the stillness that followed Lauren's exit was louder than any applause. It was the stillness of transformation, of a story shifting from tolerance to truth. As the security officers guided her out, someone in the rear whispered, "It's about time someone like her got called out." Another said, "What if Celeste hadn't been the CEO?" That question lingered like smoke. It wasn't rhetorical. It was a mirror. Back on the tarmac, Celeste's SUV rolled into a discreet executive entrance. She stepped into the Right Skies headquarters, not through the front, not through PR, but through the back, where her executive team had already assembled in the glass-walled war room. The board was there, so were legal, HR, and communications. No one asked her to sit. She didn't need to be invited. She walked to the head of the table, pulled out her phone, and tapped the screen. The surveillance footage from the plane projected on the screen behind her. The audio was clear. Lauren's voice sharp, smug, cutting. The splash of the tray, the slap, Celeste's face turning back. No theatrics, no editing, just the truth. And when the video stopped, she turned to her team. "This isn't about me," she said. "It's about every passenger who never had a title to protect them. Every complaint buried in middle management. Every silence mistaken for compliance. This ends today." She placed a printed document on the table, effective immediately mandatory retraining, bias response protocol overhaul, anonymous reporting line directly routed to the executive office. Zero tolerance clauses to be added to all service contracts. No one spoke. She looked directly at the head of HR. "You told me once that the system would self-correct. That's no longer good enough. We are not in the business of waiting for justice to become convenient." Then, finally, she sat. She didn't ask if they approved, because what they thought didn't matter as much anymore. The truth had already taken flight, and there was no grounding it now. The fallout was immediate. Before the sun fully set on the private runway where Celeste had descended from flight WS-472, her name was already surging across social media. Not because she wanted it there, she hadn't posted a word, but because the passengers had. A photo, taken discreetly by a college student in business class, showed Celeste walking down the plane's staircase flanked by two assistants, her posture straight, her face unreadable. The caption read, "The woman they tried to humiliate is actually the one who owns the sky." It exploded in minutes. But while the internet raged and praised and debated, Celeste herself didn't open a single app. She was in a room with 12 senior executives, finalizing the first complete overhaul of the airline's ethics and service protocols since its founding. Her hands didn't shake as she signed the documents. Each signature was deliberate, anchored. She didn't speak unless it added value. Her voice was low and clear, each word building the foundation of something bigger than a corporate response. It was the beginning of a systemic reckoning. Outside the boardroom, her assistant handed her a tablet. Public statement draft. Initial language is soft. We could strengthen the tone if you prefer. Celeste read it silently. It was filled with the usual phrases. We take this matter seriously. An isolated incident, committed to reevaluating procedures. She handed the tablet back. Delete it. Her assistant blinked. All of it. All of it. Celeste said, "We're not apologizing for optics. We're acknowledging failure and executing reform." That night, she wrote the statement herself. It was short, honest, devastating. No uniform or name tag grants you permission to disrespect another human being. No passenger should be valued by how they look, speak, or dress. We failed, and we are changing. Not because of backlash, but because it is overdue. It was posted on every Right Skies digital platform. Underneath, within minutes, came the flood of stories. I once got bumped to economy because I looked more comfortable back there. My husband was asked if he was the security detail for me. I'm black. He's white. Thank you. Finally, I'm sorry. Finally, someone said it, but the most impactful reactions didn't come from passengers. They came from inside the industry. Within 48 hours, 3 competing airlines issued their own public statements committing to retrain their staff on unconscious bias. 2 initiated audits of previous complaints that had been labeled inconclusive. Celeste hadn't called them. She hadn't asked for a collective response. But real leadership creates a ripple without raising its voice. In the headquarters of Right Skies, a transformation was underway. The department formerly known as Guest Experience was renamed Dignity Services. Each employee received a personal letter, not a digital memo, but a real signed letter from Celeste Morgan. It included the line, "You are not trained to manage a cabin. You are entrusted to honor human dignity at 36,000 feet." Grace Holloway, the young attendant who had spoken up mid-flight, was flown to Chicago and greeted not by HR, but by Celeste herself. In a quiet room with no cameras, Celeste handed her a new badge, Supervisor in Training, Ethical Standards Team. Grace blinked at the polished metal. "I don't know what to say." "Say yes." Celeste replied. "Then say the truth when it matters most." Grace did say yes. And on her first day in the new role, she began reviewing closed complaints cases like the one Celeste had once received from a school teacher in Atlanta. Cases dismissed not for lack of truth, but for lack of power. And while that work was beginning, a very different process unfolded across the city. In a plain government building under the jurisdiction of the Department of Transportation, Lauren Briggs sat across from 2 federal investigators. She no longer wore her uniform. Her hair was undone. Her hands fidgeted with the hem of her sleeve. Her voice, which had once controlled cabins and silenced passengers, now trembled on every vowel. It wasn't about race, she insisted. "I just thought she didn't belong in that seat." "That's not a crime, is it?" One of the investigators looked up. "You didn't think she belonged, based on what she just didn't look like a first-class passenger." The other investigator didn't flinch. "And what does that look like, Mrs. Briggs?" Lauren had no answer, because the answer itself was the indictment. The charge wasn't just assault, it was a hate crime, public misconduct on federal airspace. 12 witnesses, surveillance footage, and the cold clarity of her own recorded words. A court date was set. The airline cooperated fully. Celeste did not seek a financial settlement. She refused to be part of the cycle where institutions quietly pay to silence systemic failures. Instead, she sent a message to the judge's office, not as a CEO, but as a citizen. It read, "I will testify not for myself, but for the people she will never see, never serve, and never slap because they knew better than to speak up." That line appeared on the news. It echoed across interviews. It was printed in headlines, highlighted in editorials, and turned into placards for a protest that formed outside the courthouse on the day Lauren was arraigned. Meanwhile, inside Right Skies, change became tangible. The new training program wasn't another slideshow. It was 8 weeks, role-specific, led by sociologists and lived experience facilitators. No pre-written scripts, no simulated scenarios, real conversations, raw truths. In one session, a Black veteran shared how he'd been asked repeatedly if he knew the code to get into first class. A Muslim woman recounted being randomly selected for secondary screening on 6 consecutive flights. Staff didn't just listen. They were required to reflect, respond, and act. By week 5, resignations began not because of the pressure, but because some finally understood they were unfit to serve with dignity. Celeste didn't stop them. She welcomed it. "Let them go," she said. "The sky has no room for gatekeepers." Then came the policy that changed everything, the passenger equity standard. A digital monitoring system now tracked every interaction, how long it took to respond to a service request, who received upgrades, who was asked for ID again, who was offered assistance without being prompted. The data was colorblind, but the patterns weren't, and every pattern was reviewed. Grace led the pilot audits. She found that in 2 hubs, passengers of color were offered beverages 17% less often in premium classes. That number shocked her. But what shocked her more was how easy it had been to overlook until now. When she presented the findings to Celeste, she expected disappointment. Instead, Celeste nodded. "Truth isn't what embarrasses us," she said. "Denial is." Then she turned to the analytics team. "Now build the tool that prevents this before it starts." Across the industry, Right Skies was now being called not just an airline, but a movement. Harvard Business Review called it the most ethical turnaround since post-scandal Patagonia. The Guardian ran a headline that read, "She sat in silence. Now she redefines how we fly." But Celeste didn't care for the praise. She knew the work had only just begun, because systemic change doesn't come from a single viral moment. It comes from relentless commitment, repetition, re-education, and the courage to stand in the quiet space between policy and people. One night, weeks after the flight, Celeste sat alone in her office. The city lights stretched far beneath her. In her drawer, she kept a letter, a new one. This one came from a father whose teenage daughter had been denied boarding 3 years earlier due to incomplete attire. He'd never filed a formal complaint, but after seeing the news, he wrote, "That day still lives in her. But seeing what you did, she stood taller this week. Thank you." Celeste placed the letter next to the others. No frame, no display, just a quiet collection of truths. And she whispered, almost to herself, "We don't fly to escape gravity. We fly to find what we're willing to lift." And this time, she knew the sky had never been more ready. 2 weeks after flight WS-472 made its unplanned descent into justice, Celeste Morgan stepped into a quiet auditorium at Stanford University. The walls were curved like the inside of a seashell, designed for acoustics. But today it would serve as a place not for performance, but for reckoning. The room was filled not with luxury passengers or high-ranking executives, but with students, professors, civil rights advocates, and a few quiet faces from the aviation industry who had slipped in without name tags. They came not because of press or spectacle, but because something about what happened on that flight wouldn't leave them alone. Not the footage, not the quotes, but the silence, the moment when Celeste had soaked in water and power, when she looked straight ahead and didn't flinch. That silence had echoed, and people wanted to know why. The stage held no podium, no slideshow, just a single chair and a microphone. Celeste stepped forward, dressed not in designer formality, but in a simple white blouse and slate gray trousers. The applause was soft but steady. It didn't surge like celebrity ovations. It pulsed like gratitude. She sat, adjusted the mic, and let the silence settle before speaking. When I boarded that plane, I wasn't trying to make a point, she began. I was trying to make a decision. A pause, eyes locked. Pens hovered. I wanted to know what would happen if I stopped being the exception. If I walked into a space not as a CEO, not as a symbol, but as a woman who looked like me without the armor of title. I wanted to see who this system serves when no one's watching. A woman in the front row, likely a professor, nodded slowly. Celeste continued. And what I learned is that prejudice doesn't always raise its voice. Sometimes it smiles first. Sometimes it pours water on your lap and tells you it's your fault. Sometimes it wears a badge that says customer care, while believing some people aren't customers at all. She shifted in her seat, not nervously, but with the weight of memory. The moment I was slapped, I didn't feel rage, I felt clarity, because I remembered all the times I hadn't spoken. I remembered the hotel lobby that told me guests only, while I stood soaked from rain. I remembered being asked if I was the babysitter for my own child. I remembered boardrooms where I was offered water, but not eye contact. She stopped to breathe. The auditorium remained still, not out of politeness, but out of need. This wasn't a lecture. This was lived history. But this time, she said, I chose not to disappear. Not for the drama, not for the headlines, but because I realized how many people were still swallowing those moments every day and calling it survival. She looked up, and I was tired of surviving. A young man in the back lowered his phone after recording. His face was wet. He wasn't alone. Celeste shifted again. We've built entire industries around the idea of excellence. But what good is excellence if it only belongs to the favored? What is service if it only wraps itself around those who look like they deserve it? Her tone deepened, not louder, just fuller. Dignity is not a luxury upgrade. It's not reserved for row 1A. It's not a reward for politeness or pedigree. It is the starting point. And any system that forgets that, whether in the air or on the ground, has already crashed. The words landed like thunder wrapped in silk. Then she did something unexpected. She smiled. I didn't stand up on that flight to be brave. I stood up because I had sat down too many times before. A ripple of quiet laughs, sad and knowing, passed through the room. And when I look at what happened after the policies, the conversations, the stories that have come out, I realize this wasn't just about one woman and one tray of water. It was about the power of one person saying, that's enough. Her voice softened again. We spend so much time teaching people how to lead. But maybe we should start teaching them how to see. That was the line that made the crowd lean in. Because if Lauren Briggs had seen me not as a threat, not as a disruption, not as a seat stealer, but simply as a human being, then that flight would have taken off on time. There would be no press, no lawsuits, no reform plans, just respect. Quiet, uncomplicated. She sat back. The air shifted again. People weren't just nodding. They were holding their breath. Celeste looked out across the rows. So I leave you with this, she said. The next time you're in a position to ignore someone or to include them, ask yourself, am I acting out of habit or am I choosing to see? She stood. The applause didn't erupt. It grew slowly, like sunrise on the face of a crowd that had just seen something shift inside them. As she exited the stage, a professor followed her into the hall. Miss Morgan, you've just redefined what a leadership seminar should be. Celeste smiled gently. I wasn't trying to lead. I was just tired of following silence. That quote hit the press hours later. It was reposted across platforms, handwritten on campus walls, printed on the back of protest signs. I was just tired of following silence. But Celeste didn't stay to bask in it. That evening, she returned to the Right Skies headquarters. A new flight was departing in the morning. She would be on it, not in disguise this time, not to test anyone, but to greet passengers personally. A grandmother from Detroit, a disabled veteran, a single mom traveling with her son. Celeste welcomed them at the boarding gate, not as a figurehead, but as a reminder that this airline belonged to them, too, on board. She sat in coach. By choice, she leaned into the conversations, asked what made people feel seen, listened, learned. A little boy in 17B leaned over and asked her, "Are you the lady who made the mean lady go away?" Celeste smiled. Sort of, she said. But really, I just reminded her who we're supposed to be. The boy grinned. I think you're the captain. She laughed. Not today, but thank you. And then the plane took off, smooth, simple, no slaps, no spillages, just altitude and equity. In the clouds, silence returned not as erasure, but as peace. And for the first time in a long time, Celeste looked out the window and didn't brace herself. She breathed, and it felt like flying had finally become what it was always meant to be, equal. 3 months after Flight WS-472, the aviation world looked very different. Not because planes flew faster or seats became wider, those were cosmetic changes that had long masked deeper failures, but because passengers began walking onto planes not wondering whether they belonged, but expecting to be treated like they did. Wright Skaz Airlines had become more than a transportation company. It had become a symbol. But symbols are only powerful if they stay honest. And Celeste Morgan knew that momentum is a fragile thing, especially when it's born from pain. So while the public shifted from viral applause to everyday amnesia, she kept going not with speeches, but with structure, not with performance, but with policy. Her team had completed the full rollout of the Dignity Dashboard, a live interface that monitored in-flight behavior patterns across all routes, response times, seat change decisions, complaint escalation, and even subtle trends in how often staff initiated interaction with certain demographics. The data didn't lie. In fact, it spoke louder than any headline. There were breakthroughs, and there were setbacks. But through it all, Celeste remained present. Not from an ivory tower, but from the aisles of real flights. She flew every week coach, business, regional connectors, red eyes, long hauls. She sat next to crying toddlers, talked to retired nurses, ate plastic-covered meals with gratitude. And every time someone asked, "Aren't you the CEO?" she simply smiled and said, "Just a passenger today." But back at headquarters, something was building. A request had come in from the National Aviation Ethics Commission, an invitation for Celeste to deliver the keynote at the annual conference. It was a gathering known for its formalities and bureaucratic distance, but this year the theme had changed. The title of the event was Altitude and Humanity, Where Justice Takes Flight. Celeste agreed, but on one condition, that the closing panel would not include executives or industry veterans, but instead flight attendants, frontline staff, and passengers from marginalized communities. It was the first time in the Commission's history that non-executives would speak on its stage. The organizers hesitated, but eventually, they said yes. On the morning of the event, Celeste stood behind the stage curtain, watching the panel before hers conclude. Her speech wasn't on a teleprompter. It wasn't pre-approved. And it wasn't going to be safe. She walked onto the stage without fanfare. The audience rose instinctively, not out of obligation, but out of awareness, because they knew what she had done. They had seen the footage, read the stories, watched the reforms. But today, Celeste didn't come to talk about what happened. She came to talk about what hadn't. She stepped up to the mic. 3 months ago, she began, I was slapped in a first-class seat I had every right to occupy. Not because of a seat number, not because of my job, but because I existed in a body that some people associate with disruption rather than presence, and in that moment, something inside me refused to shrink. She took a breath. What followed was not a redemption story. It was an overdue one. And while many were inspired by what happened after policy changes, accountability, new training protocols, I need to say something that may make you uncomfortable. That slap didn't change the industry. The response to it did. The room was silent. She continued, for years, we've treated moments of injustice as anomalies. We say, that's not who we are. But I want to ask, what if it is? What if the things we excuse as mistakes are actually symptoms of a system designed to favor comfort over conscience? She paced slightly, not out of nerves, but with intention. When Lauren Briggs poured water on me and said it was my fault, that wasn't about a tray. It was about entitlement. When she slapped me and said I provoked it, that wasn't about authority. It was about the belief that some people can be punished without consequence. And when half the cabin stayed silent for so long, that wasn't fear. It was conditioning. Celeste stopped, letting the silence expand. So today, I'm not asking you to clap for what we've done right. I'm asking you to reckon with what we've tolerated. The real victory is not that I was the CEO. The real shame is that it took being the CEO to be believed. A hush fell deeper. "And I want to be very clear," she said, her voice tightening with conviction. "If I had been a hairdresser, or a substitute teacher, or a nursing assistant, if I had not had a team or a title, none of this would have happened. No policy shift, no cameras, no apology, just another woman of color being ushered out of a seat she paid for." She looked around the room, her eyes stopping briefly on the CEO of another airline, then a union leader, then a regional director of cabin operations. "We say we want justice, but we outsource it to luck. We hope the person harmed is powerful enough to speak. That's not equity. That's roulette." Then she did something no one expected. She pulled a letter from her coat pocket. "This is from a passenger on flight WS472. She never spoke during the incident, but a week later, she mailed this." Celeste unfolded the paper and read, "I didn't say anything when it happened. I thought you looked strong enough to handle it, but now I realize strength isn't an excuse for silence. It's a reason to stand beside it." Celeste folded the letter. "Let that be the message we leave here with: strength deserves support, not observation." She stepped away from the mic. The applause didn't start right away. It took a second, but when it came, it was thunderous. Not for performance, for permission. Permission to feel, to reflect, to begin again after the event. Celeste didn't stay for interviews. She walked out the side door and met Grace Holloway in the hallway. Grace had flown in early to support the panel and had been watching from the wings. "You told them the part no one wants to say," Grace whispered. "I told them what they needed to remember." Celeste replied. Grace smiled. "We're about to board the return flight. Want to take the lead on announcements?" Celeste laughed. "Only if I get to hand out peanuts, too." They walked down the terminal together. No camera crews followed. No photographers snapped shots. Just two women, bound not by title but by truth. As they approached the gate, a gate agent who recognized Celeste stood up straighter. "Miss Morgan, would you like to pre-board?" Celeste shook her head. "No, I'll board last today. Let the people go first. That's the point, isn't it?" And so she did. She boarded last, took a seat in the back. The flight took off into a sky not cleaner, not quieter, not cured, but conscious. And maybe that was the greatest change of all. Not that power had shifted, but that people had started to see it differently. As the clouds parted, a sliver of sunlight hit her window, and Celeste Morgan closed her eyes not to sleep, but to rest in something rarer. Hope, the kind you build not on titles but on truth spoken when the world finally listens.